June the 7th. I'm WESH 2 meteorologist Eric Burris, joined by...
And I'm Chief Meteorologist Jeremy Nelson from WJCL 22 in Savannah.
All right, so Jeremy, this is our weekly Tracking the Tropics feature. Had to delay, and I apologize. I'm obviously still at work right now. I was at work yesterday, and so I kind of had to do the work thing, so I do apologize for that. But let's just get caught up on where we are in terms of the tropics.
Yeah, I mean, we did a little special episode on Friday, and it was sort of previewing what our lean developed, pronounced a tropical depression at that time. We could wrap things up, and I'd say 2 or 3 hours later, early afternoon, the National Hurricane Center said, hey, tropical storm Arlene formed. So that's the second storm of the season and the first named storm. Of course, the first storm of 2023 was the subtropical storm back in mid-January. So we've had 2 storms, 1 named, and here we are into early June.
That's right. And the good news, at least for right now, is that things are nice and quiet. Let's just take a look and see where we're at in terms of the tropics right now. We've got nothing on the scopes. Did have one little area that the National Hurricane Center had highlighted as a potential area for subtropical development, possible. That has now dropped off to a 0% chance. Never really, Jeremy, thought that was going to get into anything, but that's been the only thing we've watched since Arlene formed.
Yeah, I mean, it's very quiet across the Atlantic Basin. Every single episode we've done so far, we've been talking about how once we got outside of what we term the Nicole part of the pattern, which did prompt Arlene, is that headed down from the Eastern Gulf, then down into the southwestern Atlantic Ocean near the Bahamas is just like a remnant little low pressure trough area. Now we're into the part of the pattern where we should see a bit of a lull, but again, there's a couple areas we're watching. We'll get into that a little bit later.
That's right. Yeah, when we get into the long-range stuff. But as far as where we stand for the season, Jeremy, let's just get into some nerdy stuff. You and I are we're both nerds, so I suppose that this fits. Let's start with the numbers. ACE. So first off, what is ACE for anybody that wants to be a little nerdy?
All right, so accumulated cyclone energy. A lot of people say this is probably one of the best metric gauge a hurricane season as a whole, because you have these systems like Arlene, which are extremely brief. I believe it registered as less than a day that it was even a tropical storm. So this takes into account the winds, how long it was a tropical system, and then you add that metric up. And remember, we had some ACE kind of points or scores or numbers added up in January too with that subtropical system. So right now, we're at an ACE of 2.6. The 30-year average by this point is 1.3, and that really isn't like a huge difference. Last year at this time, it was near average. So a little bit above average, but really not that far.
Right. All right. So that's where we're at right now. Okay. So great. We're ahead of last year. We're ahead of the average, but it's just because we kind of had those 2 systems. When we look at some of the other metrics, Jeremy, let's take a look. For example, this is the named storm days, and I think that the ACE and the named storm days go directly head to head with everything. 3 days with a named storm. The 30-year average through today is 1.6, and last year was 1.5. So a little bit of a brisker start, we'll say. A little bit of a brisker start this year?
Yeah. I mean, if you take June and July, though, and you add up, I think it's since 1851, we've showed this before, named storms by month. It's only about, I think, less than 15% of all named storms if you add up June and July. I think June was like 5% of all named storms, give or take maybe 0.5% either side of that. And then July is just a little bit more than that. It's mid-August through, I always say, about the first week or 10 days of October. That's really the heart of hurricane season.
Yep. Yeah. So here's the kind of the numbers for, and I'll just widen it out so that we've got both of our coverage areas there. But so for June tropical systems, there are only 6% of them, right? But of course, that said, we've had 107 named storms during the month of June, 33 hurricanes. But one thing that's interesting, when I did the research, Jeremy, there have been 2 major hurricanes that have formed during the month of June, which you really wouldn't expect that to be the case.
No, but yeah, I'm actually a little bit on the opposite side. Maybe I'm surprised that it seems that low because we've had hurricanes form in the month of January. So the fact
Yeah.
there's only been two major hurricanes from the research you did is, to me, that seems like, oh, that's kind of low. Like we've never had even uh, more than like Category 2 hurricane, just a couple of them, and
Yeah.
those records date back pretty far.
Oh yeah, I mean 1851 is where it goes back. The one thing that's interesting, and certainly I am not over here like cheering for a major hurricane or anything,
Right.
but looking at the basin as it stands today, these water temperatures, Jeremy, are the warmest that they've ever been getting into June from May. I mean, the water temperatures as a whole are very, very warm, 2-3 degrees above average. And of course, we know that tropical cyclones develop from warm waters. So this will be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the warm water there, for everyone, that's like some of those, the yellow to the orange and red colors is where you're talking about the anomaly being much higher than average there. And then those blue colors, you can really see though the Eastern Gulf and hugging the southeast coastline are a little bit below average, and that's because the Memorial Day coastal storm we had, and then
Yep.
Arlene, that
Yep.
turn that warm surface water up, so you get like an upwelling. The cooler water below will move into the surface for that warmer water that's been displaced. So
Yeah.
that's what you're looking at there. And up in that northern tier of the Atlantic, maybe not quite as warm, but what we'll start watching the closer you get to like peak hurricane season later in the summer is those systems that want to leave the thunderstorms of the west coast of Africa, and we'll see if that really warm water plays a role.
Now, one other thing as you're mentioning this, Jeremy, is, just looking at that monsoonal flow coming off the coast of Africa, it's actually doing pretty decent for, being early June, in my opinion. Now, not that these are like looking to develop or anything, but that monsoonal flow is definitely more rigorous than as is normal for early hurricane season.
Yeah, and again, we don't really see that till maybe sometime a little bit later in July, and then especially August and September. That's one of the focal points is that part of the Atlantic basin. Right now, we look for maybe closer to homegrown storms into the
Right.
Gulf of Mexico, a little bit closer to the southeast coastline, and then also down into the Caribbean. And I know in a little while we'll talk when we do maybe our talk about June as a whole. We'll start discussing what maybe one model or so is trying to show and how it ties in maybe to a part of the pattern.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've got the computer models that we're definitely going to be reviewing for sure. But at least for now, we're nice and quiet. One thing, Jeremy, you did some research between our episodes of Tracking the Tropics, and you found some data on the kind of the European computer forecast model's seasonal approach. Now, I don't have graphics to support it, but could you
Right.
elaborate a little bit on what you found?
Yeah, I mean, Eric and I are on social media a lot. There's a lot of fantastic people that are posting about tropics, and they had kind of a seasonal look from the European model that came out here within the last week, and that was indicating potential for maybe a little more activity in the Atlantic basin. But then you go back and you think, well, preseason of 2022, our forecast was for pretty much an average season. A lot of them came out with active. The European model also was showing more of an active season. So fast forward to right now, European again is saying, hey, this could be a little more active than previously what we thought. And maybe it's due to that warmer water in the Atlantic, but we'll see how that plays out. But again, the European model is probably at least a little bit above average.
And that's going back to what we had discussed on our very first Tracking the Tropics discussion, talking about how our forecast was calling for a slightly above hurricane season. Phil Klotzbach from Colorado State University came out, updated his numbers a little bit. And I think that the big question mark here when it comes to seasonal forecasting is how does El Nino play in against these particularly warm ocean temperatures?
Right. And that European forecast that came out this week had the Caribbean very quiet. I think that it had it a little more wet looking closer to Florida. We definitely expect that. That is clearly hotspot number one. And then maybe up southeast coastline towards the Carolinas, and then kind of wet into portions of the Atlantic. So definitely had a little drier look in the Caribbean. We'll see if that plays out. But again, strengthening El Nino. We'll see how maybe that wild card plays out as the season goes on.
Oh, for sure. Look at these water temperatures, Jeremy. You know, the Caribbean is already boiling. I mean, not really, of course, but, you know, we're already talking about mid-80s there. The loop current in the Gulf of Mexico sitting at 84. Water temperatures outside of the Bahamas and the Gulf Stream are in the upper 70s and lower 80s, whereas the Gulf Stream just off the coast of Florida is at 83. And you know, when we look out to the Eastern Caribbean, we're already to 83. These temperatures are very, very warm, so it does certainly support tropical activity. And as you had mentioned, you know, the computer models are already starting to hint at things. So I suppose now's as good a time as ever to kind of chime in and just see what some of the computer models are showing, right?
So obviously, before we start our discussion here, if the GFS was correct, every single year there'd probably be 50 to 100 hurricanes. I mean, that's a model that goes out like 10 days or so, and it's pretty notorious for putting a look of a hurricane towards the end of the run during hurricane season way too often.
It just loves to find spin and kick it down the curb. That it just keeps doing that, and we saw it. How long did we do? I mean, you have such a better memory than I do. Do you remember how long we went last year with a lull, right?
Well, August had no named storms, but even the start of the season, I think we had 3 named storms by the 4th of July because Colin formed on like July 1st or 2nd. But it just was not a busy start to the season last year. But again, there were a lot of storms showing up late in some of these computer model runs. So that's why kind of have to tap the brakes. Obviously, it's something when it shows up, then we kind of start monitoring it. But I feel like you and I, with the methodology we use in creating our hurricane season forecast, which is nothing new, we've been doing it for years. Anyone can go back and look at kind of the verification, how we've done, the parts of the pattern we picked out, the hot spots, all of that. So without getting into that too much, what the GFS is showing, not necessarily the strength of it, because as you showed, a major hurricane, extremely, extremely rare during the month of June. However, though, is it trying to pick up on something that may develop? Well, I mean, we'll see. If you go back to the first episode of this, when we were previewing June, we had already talked about 2 areas, potentially southern Bay of Campeche, or down in that area, southern Gulf of Mexico, Bay of Campeche, and then maybe something off from the northeast coastline. Once we get into that kind of like, maybe what is that, like the 3rd week into the start of the 4th week of June.
Right. All right. So I've got the calendar up here. It's the same calendar that we showed on our first episode or so. So you've got like the last couple of weeks of June. So we're at the 7th. We know that this is going to be a lull, but like next week into the following week, we start to watch for that activity around the Bay of Campeche and South Texas, ish, not necessarily talking about an impact there, but that's the area that we start to watch.
Right. So, I mean, you go all the way back with the method we use, the pattern sets up October. We really watch October, November. It was busy during those 2 months, so we have picked out some important features there. We're just coming off what we term the Nicole part of the pattern. So then we start looking ahead later or actually before. So we had Nicole, and then I went all the way back to my notes, very early part of October. And this is what we're kind of curious about. We're like, how does this play out? In the Caribbean, we had Hurricane Julia, and then we also had Carl down in the Bay of Campeche. So those are sort of just our areas of interest that we'll be watching. And is the GFS trying to kind of sniff something out down there? You show the water is very warm. Wouldn't take a lot if you do get something in a favorable area to develop. Is it going to look like the GFS? I would probably say not, just because of what we know, the history of it. It just blows things up like crazy.
Right. So here's the GFS, and just to illustrate like the version of the GFS that we're looking at. This is looking at mean sea level pressure anomalies. So orange is the warmer shades here. That's going to be higher pressure, quieter air, quieter atmosphere, whereas the blues and purples and greens, that's lower pressure. So obviously we've got some moisture around Florida the next couple of days. We know that to be true, an old frontal boundary. But let's just keep going, okay? Nice high pressure, those warmer shades. But toward the end of the GFS run, you start to see those purples and those whites on the bottom of the screen. That's what the GFS, it's just like laughable, right? That's what the GFS looks like when it wants to try and spin something up. And in this case, what is it? That's a 981, 970, 963. It's trying to develop a major hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. There have been 2 hurricanes that have gotten to major status during the month of June. We discussed this. So the expectation is the GFS is, a little tipsy, but it's trying to pick up on some moisture around the 18th or so of the month, kind of around the Bay of Campeche, lifting to the north. Is that the craziest thing you've ever heard? Well, if you look at that calendar, the 18th, 19th, 20th, you're getting into that part of the weather pattern that we had highlighted months ago as having some activity around the Bay of Campeche.
Yeah, and maybe this just ends up being low pressure, whatever. If it develops into something tropical, it could even cross Central America. We've seen that before. Yeah. This time of year, where it goes from Caribbean and crosses over into the Pacific too. So, it's something on our radar. And really, the rest of this month, we just kind of have whatever would happen down there, and then maybe a low pressure area off from the mid-Atlantic or Northeast, but we think that should stay off from those areas, not travel into them.
And then we get into a more active pattern looking ahead to July. That's going to be the Nicole part of the pattern. That's where you get Florida being back in play and the Carolinas being back in play. And it'll be interesting with these warm water temperatures as they are, and maybe an atmosphere more conducive to tropical development, full-on summer, what that looks like heading into July.
Yeah, and I know you have all these graphics, so maybe I'll give you a second. Do you have the European ensemble? Because obviously we showed the GFS, and I know the European ensembles as of yesterday really was not showing much of anything going on in the tropics. I don't know if you have an updated one.
I'm working on it.
It was pretty quiet looking yesterday.
All right, give me 2 seconds. I'm getting there. Multi-member, low locations.
And then obviously, if anyone has questions along the way, I know once Eric pops that up, we can take some questions too. I'll try to look over here and see if I'm finding anything.
Yep. So one thing that Chris is saying, Chris says consistent with the GFS runs for the same date or always at the end of the run. He's asking about that area of low pressure.
Yeah, that's one thing it's notorious for, that maybe after day 8 or 9, it seems like it always has that storm and it just never gets closer. So this time we're kind of like, hey, maybe this is an area we've already highlighted. It's kind of trying to put something in that area. Let's just at least watch it here and see as we start to draw closer. Or will another model start to just hint at maybe a weaker low or something like that down there?
Well, and I've noticed too, it's still running a little early on the GFS, so perhaps it's going to keep kicking it down the line and then stop and kind of try and focus in on something there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, this time of year, I would say Caribbean into the Gulf and then near the southeast coast. Those are kind of the favorite areas, not quite as far out into the Atlantic.
Yeah. All right, so here's the European ensemble plot. And just, so this is, let me go to the 60 only goes out 144 hours. So let's just move that out.
Oh, okay.
So high pressure, Bermuda high, looking nice. That's the 21st. That's 2 p.m. on Wednesday, the 21st. Notice all the way out. That's 354 hours out. One ensemble member has 1,002 millibar low in the Caribbean. So it's not on the same page as the GFS was.
Right. And then also, are you able to move that up from like the Carolinas to New England to see if there's anything kind of off there?
Yes. Give me 2 seconds. let's see here. Okay, so there's nothing, nothing like right here. So that's the, I'm just trying to see here. So that's the February. That's Friday, June 9th. Let me just.
Okay.
So that's a little early. Yeah. So the offshore, like the New England is like the 13th or so. So if we just.
Yeah, I would think it'd be, if we see something off from, at least from what our version of it, it would be more like the middle of the month. I think the 13th would be a bit early.
Now this is the European. Let's look at the GFS ensemble. The European doesn't really see much. There's stuff around, but nothing, nothing of note. Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing of note.
So I mean, we'll keep a close eye on these. It's always good to look at the ensembles, but I mean, we showed the GFS. Obviously, we want to show a different model there, and the European again at this moment. Not really much, but this is still a long ways out. We're only at the 7th, and we're talking about something that might be 1 or 2 weeks away.
Yeah, exactly. Mickey says the GFS has been pretty terrible the last couple of years. I think that they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but the GFS, particularly in that stretch where we had nothing going on, the GFS it's like got this bias for vorticity, I feel like.
Right, and I would say the GFS notoriously is pretty terrible far out for tropics. When it gets in a little bit closer, I think it has shown some improvement in recent years. So, but I don't know if I would take any one model that goes out more than 5 days and say, oh, that one is the all-time greatest. I mean, all of them seem to have their moments. I would say short term, last year what I found, and this isn't really like a public model because our weather vendor, the graphics people we use, I really liked the IBM model last year. Once you got within 60 to 72 hours. I mean, with Hurricane Ian, we were like, whoa, this is way different. It has the track way farther south along that west coast of Florida. And it ended up being very, very close to what actually happened. And then the other models trended in that direction.
I 100% agree. And I noticed, so I got an email today. Let me go and find this. So there's a weather conference, Jeremy, in Boston for our weather vendor. And one of the things that they just published is what's new with that model. And as soon as I saw that, I'm like, I am going to that session. So I'm going to be in Boston for that conference. And I'm very excited to see, because I also got an email yesterday. They're upping the computing power for it, and that's our FutureCast model that we all run internally. And so it's. I also agree. I think that model, the IBM model, did an outstanding job, and I think that I think there's always room for improvement. But I think that on the near term, 100%, it did the best. It really did.
And
the best.
Even. We have a super small sample size this year. I thought it did great this time with the track of our lean. It did strengthen it probably a little more than it actually got to this time, but it did well with the track of it. So I feel like it's doing really good when it comes to these tracks of tropical systems.
Do you think that it overdid the Arlene strength? Because and we could, when we've had this discussion about tropical, subtropical, non-tropical, but like there were hurricane gusts on buoys in that ship. So like I think the IBM model did a great job. Maybe it was overzealous on rain.
So I was talking about Arlene.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes, thank you. I was up at 2 o'clock this morning. My brain is half of what it should be.
That's all right. So with Arlene. Yeah, I think it had. I don't know what the pressure got down to. It was below 1,000, right?
But it was bringing Arlene to like a 50, 60 mile per hour tropical storm.
Yeah, it had the pressure to like 985 millibars, I believe, at one point on that model. So it did good. I feel like it did pretty good on the track. The pressure strength probably not as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear what the vendor thinks the success has been with the model, what the vendor thinks the room for improvement is, and Jeremy, I never hold anything back. So if we as a collective have any questions about the model, let's throw them to the fire there in that discussion, because I'll be there. So with the programmers and the science PhDs that program the dang thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I've given them feedback. This was probably at least a couple of years ago, but
Yeah.
down here, that model was doing horrible. It was showing the sea breeze every single day, way too strong, way too cool at temperatures at the coastline. So they have addressed that, and I think at least where I'm at, when I use it for temperatures, it has gotten better. So I think whether it's the IBM model, I know the European model, they've really worked to get that better. The GFS has had improvements. So modeling as a whole continues to get better. It's definitely not perfect, but at least we're headed in the direction that hopefully it will just continue to improve forecasts.
And that's one thing that the National Hurricane Center advertised at the Governor's Hurricane Conference here in Florida was that they feel like the modeling is getting to a point that they are doing better on intensity forecasting. There's such a subjectivity to it all, right? And that we could have an argument all day long about. But I would tend to agree. If we look at what happened in Ian, they were very aggressive on intensity forecasting, Jeremy, very early on in the game. And intensity forecasting has always been the piece of the forecasting puzzle that has been terribly difficult and terribly inconsistent.
Yeah, and I think just ingesting Hurricane Hunter more real-time data into some of these models is helping. So anytime Hurricane Hunters are able to fly into these, even if they're small systems, that way you can just learn. And especially for the Hurricane Center, when they do analysis looking back, it just improves everything as a whole.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So let's take a couple of seconds here and say to everybody that's joining us, if you have any questions or comments or little things to add, we'd love to hear from you. Debbie says, "What a difference in me from this morning. So professional now." I was punch drunk, man. Like a 5.5 hour morning show. It was a mess. But yeah, we've got to keep the tie on for the tracking the tropics. And I think though that the computer models being programmed to better handle the recon data has also helped.
Yeah, and I know you and I have both met some of the hurricane hunters. I actually went down to Orlando several years ago when they had the Hurricane Awareness Tour, and a lot of people watching us live either like Gulf Coast, Southeast, or Florida. And every year the hurricane hunters visit a number of communities in our area. So if they're near you, I encourage you, go there. It really helps you understand why they go out and fly around and into these storms and the technology they're using. And the drop zones, I mean, they're pretty basic as a whole, but they just do get us incredible data.
Well, and it's another thing that just you made me wonder, like here in Central Florida, the NOAA recon is based at the Lakeland Linder Regional Airport, which is just a little bit outside of the Orlando area. And I don't know the answer. Don't just go driving to the hangar. But like, I do wonder if they offer like public tours where folks that are interested could go, as long as they're not like busy running missions, of course. But like while they're washing the airplane, like they're out there, sudsing it up. Like, can Tom come show up? I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, the Air Force recon is up at Keesler in Mississippi, but for the Florida folks here, Lakeland's not that far.
Right. Yeah, and whether the systems are close or far away, they're always out there. And I think it's just great for the public. They get the opportunity at least about 5-6 times each year in different locations to go out. And you can actually, you can go in there and you can tour the planes. They'll walk you through it. And it's pretty amazing to see what it is. And then have you gone before? I know they offer sometimes media to go fly with them. I have not, because if I get in something that rough, I'll be sick and I'll ruin everyone's experience.
See, and for me, like learning to fly airplanes, I feel like that's one of those things where I could handle the turbulence. But I've been in weather 22 years, Jeremy, and I've never found a way to get my name on the list. But I also feel like that's such a double-edged sword, because I feel like if there's a storm threat, like what would end up happening is a storm's threatening Florida, my name gets pulled, and then they have to pull me out of the 12 on, 12 off coverage to put me on an airplane to turn a silly package. Whereas if a storm was threatening Texas, that would be the perfect time for a Florida meteorologist to go do a story on it, because obviously there's no big threat to us, you know?
Yeah, I think we had a reporter at WJCL. It may have been Dorian that they got to go on one of the missions with. It wasn't a meteorologist, but one of our reporters went with. I almost feel like it was Dorian. Maybe that was in like, what, 2019?
So, yeah.
2018?
Yep.
Yep.
All right, so a couple of questions. No, go ahead. Finish your thought. I apologize.
No. I'm ready. What are the questions?
All right, so Brian's asking, when is El Nino supposed to start fully taking effect? And what's it going to mean for storm formations during hurricane season this year, Jeremy?
I think it'll, if it's going to, probably maybe later summer into fall, especially this upcoming winter. If it's going to have an influence on something, I would say we'll start to really see it kick in then. But I mean, that water is forecast to warm up quite a bit, but it seems like that whole Pacific almost into the Atlantic is warm.
Yeah, it's really a weird deal. I mean, we're watching the El Nino kicking in, but it's not like it's cooling the Atlantic side. So it is going to be interesting to see, you know, how this ends up playing out. All right, Priscilla says, glad to hear you can never have too much modeling to better intensity forecasting, and then went on to thank us for going through everything that we do for tracking the tropics. Let's see here. Sharon, why is there such a big difference between the American and European models? For me, I always like to think of it as you're going out on 2 dates with 2 different people. They're going to be different. You could even go out with like identical twins and they would be different, right? I don't know. That's the way I always like to think of it, Jeremy.
Yeah, I don't know. Once you get past like 8-9 days, some of these models, they develop crazy things, whether it's massive severe weather outbreaks, hurricanes, huge ridges. You see it a lot. Because what happens is these are based on math equations, and once you introduce maybe one error, one wrong thing into the model, it just starts compounding, and then it just it really can snowball as you get later into that. So that's why I think using our long range method, we already have an idea of the periods that something should happen. So then when we do see these things show up, whether they're way too intense or maybe a little bit in the wrong spot, once we see those things pop up and we're like, hey, that sort of fits what we're thinking, let's watch that closely.
Right. And that's why it's almost like cheating. It's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. Listen, I mean, you know, nobody's perfect. Nothing is perfect. But at least it gives us ideas to watch. So, like, here we are. It's June 7th. So next week, we're probably going to at least watch the channel of water just off the east coast of the United States, just to see if something wants to try and get going. That would be the recycle of what was that January 16th subtropical system. And then, you know, looking ahead to the week following, from like the 20th through the 24th, it's going to be that southern Gulf, you know, the Bay of Campeche area, which may or may not be what the GFS is already trying to show. But it's nice because it's kind of like adding another tool to the tool chest, and I think that that's very beneficial to us. You can't depend on the computer models perfectly. You can't depend on our long-range forecasting perfectly, but you can dial into it all and use all of it, stepping back to see the forest through the trees.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious when the GFS, when that one run is going to come out and everything kind of poof, it's like it's gone, or it's just back to kind of reality, something a lot smaller.
There was a meteorologist in my market that does not work at WESH that posted the 386 or whatever hour, and he was just like, look at the and it was just like everybody's freaking out, and it's like, wow, way to not be responsible, you know? Like, yeah,
I mean, almost every day we could probably post something that would really raise people's attention on some things. So yeah,
but that's not what we do. That's just not what we do.
Yeah, I mean, to each anyone can post what they want. In the day of social media, I mean, that stuff is going to get out there anyways. There's a lot of whether you call it just weather enthusiasts, amateurs. Hey, I'm glad social media wasn't around when I was growing up and I was way into the weather, or who knows? Maybe I would have posted something like that.
You know, I think that you can post anything you want responsibly if you add perspective,
Yeah.
and I think that's that's my thing. So I don't know. Mike's talking about the major hurricane the GFS is showing. It's not supposed to happen. LRC recycle. Is there a chance? He's asking about it. And we've been talking about this for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think it's sort of, we have a window that opens where we're like, hey, something might happen in the Caribbean or that maybe far southern area of the Gulf.
Right.
It's that second or that kind of that third, maybe into the fourth week of June.
Right.
There might be a reflection of something there. We'll see, but I think our interest is really peaked once we get into July. Should be a little more active in some stretches, and then that late sort of like last week or two of August into the first week or two of September. That's going to
be busy.
Definitely what we are watching.
Yeah, my wife's worried because the busier time frame in July, I've got a wedding in New England, and I've got that weather conference in New England as well. And so it's like, we're buying tickets and doing all this, and it's like, well, we'll have to see how it all plays out at the end of the day.
Yeah, you may not want to schedule your vacation around like September 5th to 14th. You might want to make sure you're around there.
Nope. I fully plan on it. Any other questions, friends? At 10:36, Brian's asking for Jeremy. I asked this yesterday. Curious to see your answer. Oh boy. Using retired names only, which storm did the most damage money-wise from its initial formation until the storm died out? I mean, I went and looked at the data, Brian. It's not like it's an opinion-based thing. He had asked me about the most expensive storm. It's Katrina.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
I would say also it towards the top has to be maybe like, would Irma be up there? Michael?
I would think so. Yeah. Those are going to be on the list, but which
Maria probably damage? Maria just devastated Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about Katrina is it wasn't even necessarily the landfall of the storm itself, but rather the levee bursting and all of the flooding from that. So, all right, that's it. That's it. Enough of this thing. Listen, we have talked, we have laughed, we have cried, but I think that the one good thing to note, if there is anything, is that for now the tropics are nice and quiet, but looking ahead to the forecast pattern, we're going to be watching kind of off the northeast United States next week. Probably nothing developing, but you may get a little storm system. And then, Jeremy, it's the Bay of Campeche from about the 20th through the 24th to watch.
Yeah, that's kind of our areas of interest. And then pretty much once we get past around the 4th of July or so, July could have a little more activity.
Yep, it'll be busy. But for now, that is it. We'll be back Tuesday, tracking the tropics Tuesdays next week. I'll be at home. Not here, thankfully. So good times. Listen, thank you all for hanging out. I'm WESH 2 meteorologist Eric Burris.
I am WJCL 22 Chief Meteorologist Jeremy Nelson. Awesome that everyone joined us.
Bye, y'all.